Thanks very much for joining us for episode 22 of InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my co-host for this edition, InTek President Shelley Austin. On this episode, we're once again turning our attention to cross-border freight between the U.S. and Mexico. Let's get started. Shipping between the U.S. and Mexico is nothing new, but there are some new factors and new opportunities, including the growing nearshoring market at play for companies with or looking to establish a cross-border strategy. Joining us to discuss the situation is Richard Miller of Spearpoint Logistics. Richard, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to InTek and Shelley and Rick, longtime friends, industry icons, and partners in this space as well. So thanks for having me.
Great. Tell us about Spearpoint and what it is that you do there.
Absolutely. Spearpoint Logistics is a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business. We provide warehousing, transportation, and managed services throughout the U.S. Ken, we're really relatively young company. We've onboarded some tenured leadership, and we've got the company poised to really grow with differentiated service solutions based on market demands of today. Our warehousing vertical provides solutions within Spearpoint Logistics controlled facilities as well as third-party facilities throughout the country. And our transportation group provides both asset and non-asset solutions at both rail and port terminals, as well as transloading and warehousing solutions when needed. And then lastly, our managed services team really provides logistical type support in various forms to serve medical institutions across the country, as well as government entities. So really focus on warehousing, transportation, and then this managed services area at Spearpoint Logistics.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. So you and I were fortunate enough to have dinner at one of my favorite places, Perry's, a couple of weeks ago, and we had a pork chop. And I'm still on this, Richard, that is not a pork chop. Like, it's its own type of meal. I don't know if you would agree, but it's fantastic. And you were able to enlighten me a little bit more on this opportunity in Dallas, and I call it a CFS for the Mexico market. And I was thoroughly enthralled and excited about it because we're really trying to bring a lot of solutions into what's up and coming in Mexico. And a couple episodes prior, we had Eduardo Morales, and he was talking about some cross-border shipping between the U.S. and Mexico. And one of the things we were interested is if you could kind of explain to us about what you have going on in Dallas and how that gives an opportunity to this up and coming Mexico market.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shelley, you're right. I think 3 people shared one pork chop and there were leftovers. So,
exactly.
You're absolutely right. So, by the way, Eduardo, I thought did a really fine job of summarizing the market. I think before you get into specifics around our solutions, it's kind of important to really understand, where's the Mexico market at today and then where's it going? And, if you look back from 1992 through 2022, so a 30-year period, Mexico exports to the U.S. in terms of value have a 9% compounded annual growth rate over that 30-year period. And during that time, there's really only 2 major declines. So 2008 and in 2020, we saw some pretty major drops, which quickly rebounded. And so it's a pretty nice, from an economic standpoint, pretty nice CAGR, pretty flat, straight upward line over a long period of time. So it's a true picture of what I would say, a true picture of consistent growth over a long period. And we really haven't seen the impact of nearshoring just yet. So with that in mind, I'm thinking about that market today, really prior to getting to nearshoring, our solution that we put in place that we call the new borders is a completely new heavyweight Mexico intermodal solution that really attempts to solve many challenges that Mexico importers to the U.S. face today. And so keeping in mind that you've got this 9% CAGR in growth in terms of value, you also have what is really kind of interesting is as of today, about a 44% imbalance, which in terms of value of goods, which is growing quarter to quarter. And that's to say that there's more exports coming to the U.S. than exports going into Mexico, if you will. And that's based on value of goods. If you talk to folks in the industry, depending on who you talk to, most people think that number is about for every 2 to 2.5 trucks coming northbound, there's only 1 truck going southbound to pull freight out of Mexico. So heavily imbalanced. And then secondly, historically and still today, the majority of the exports are over the road. And those exports are facing growing concerns in terms of security and border congestion issues. Additionally, driver shortages are becoming a real issue in Mexico as well. And again, keep in mind, this is all really before the impacts of nearshoring. So many challenges with the current model. And as we think about nearshoring, the growth of nearshoring basically, if you look at, what Morgan Stanley has put out is basically about a 54% increase due to nearshoring impacts over the next 5 years. So that's on top of that 9% CAGR. So major growth coming at us. And so what the New Border solution is an opportunity that removes many of those challenges. The project was developed with our partner Transportes EASO, which is one of the largest Mexican trucking companies and largest Mexican intermodal provider. The basic concept is to load an EASO 53-foot private container in Mexico, which can be loaded overweight and shipped by rail to BNSF's Alliance, Texas rail terminal here in Fort Worth, Texas. This allows you to bypass the border, dramatically reduce security infractions, reduce costs, and improve carbon emissions. If one is able to load overweight, this will reduce the needed capacity by roughly 25% and further lower costs and emissions. Spearpoint Logistics has an Alliance warehouse adjacent to the BNSF intermodal ramp. We enjoy the use and access to a private gate entrance, which feeds directly into our industrial park with private overweight roads. So no overweight permits required to move between the intermodal terminal and our warehouse. So once your product is at our warehouse, we can simply transload or swing from the EASO container to an outbound 53-foot container trailer, or a customer can inventory product at our warehouse and utilize it as a DC for inbound Mexico production. Either way, being in Alliance is a massive benefit to the shipper, as DFW is traditionally an inbound market with very little outbound transportation. This results in consistent capacity and at the lowest cost available for outbound transportation. So that's kind of a summary of both the way we see the market and why we think this solution is perfect for the market today.
So again, just as I was at dinner, this is fascinating to me. And one of the things, Richard, to kind of clear up and let our audience know about on this, is it just certain commodities? I mean, or what about temp control? I mean, sometimes food commodities can be heavy, right? So tell us a little bit about what you see in the commodities. And I find it interesting. I'm going to do a two-parter here for you, Richard, so hang on tight. I find it interesting that you said the same thing that we heard before is nearshoring and this big boom of Mexico really hasn't started yet, but you're seeing the signs of it. And, it's definitely going to occur, but you're seeing the signs of it. So can you kind of, bringing the first part and the second part together, can you kind of give us kind of commodities and industries that you see moving into this Mexico market that would be a good fit for this solution?
Yeah, no, great question. And let's take the nearshoring one just quickly because, first of all, nearshoring, some people call it reshoring. Some people get those terms confused a bit. But at the end of the day, it's really about moving production from other places in the world, and primarily China and Asian countries, back to Mexico or nearby, if you will. But Mexico is really the topic of conversation here. So we're seeing dramatic, increases in those companies moving back to Mexico or expanding current production in Mexico. To be real, though, that production really hasn't hit the market yet. And it takes actually much greater length of time typically to build production capabilities in Mexico than it would be in the US. And so we anticipate that beginning to hit the market over the next 18 months, 2 years. And as that really does, that's going to be on top of this production that has already seen, like I said, a 9% CAGR over a long period of time. So if you think about 76% of all Mexico imports go to the US already, and then over the next 5 years, that growing 54%, that's the major impact yet to come. So that's the nearshoring impact. In terms of commodities, in terms of northbound commodities, most of what we've built this model around is dry commodities. In our warehouse in Alliance, we do have a little over 30,000 square feet of chilled or air-conditioned space, and that's based on use for like chocolates, wines, olive oils, those types of commodities. Historically, intermodal has not had a big impact in terms of reefer intermodal going in and out of Mexico. We're on the forefront of that starting to have some inroads at this point, I do anticipate that over time, I think we'll see that build and grow. But today, by far and away, the majority of what moves intermodal is, in fact, dry commodities. And the commodities that make most sense for our solution is really those heavyweight commodities because we can move that heavyweight and you get about a 25% reduction, as I said. So all of a sudden that has a major impact, both cost, capacity, and also your carbon footprint. That's not to say that it doesn't work for commodities that cube out before they weigh out. We have shippers that have committed already to shipping volumes that are lightweight commodities as well. It's just that the larger heavyweight commodities, certainly you see a larger impact. But commodities will range from tile to consumer package type goods. We've had candy makers, we've had all different kinds of interest in the product and commitments to the service.
Excellent.
And talking about getting across the border in as seamless a fashion as possible. I mean, we've seen some stories recently where, the traditional over-the-road borders are dealing with some added inspection requirements that have backed things up, perhaps even worse than typical. So how does this solution help companies to avoid, having to deal with that?
Yeah, great question, Kevin. And before I answer that, I think I'd be remiss not to mention that, first of all, a lot of this is driven on what's happening at the border from a people standpoint. And it is an absolute tragedy to see this taking place. And this includes, those crossing the border and those living on both sides of the border, as well as authorities that are involved. They're somehow all caught up in the middle of generally an inhumane process. And having grown up on the Arizona border, I'm very familiar with the history and the challenges faced by everyone affected. It's just a tragedy. And having said that, and attempting to set all politics aside, the countries are both very reliant on mutual trade. Overland crossings generally are more affected than rail crossings, but not always the case, as we saw recently. The overall situation seems to have reached a tipping point over the last couple of months, and we all remain hopeful that a more humane resolution is nearby, which, if that's resolved, we do feel like, that will ease some of the challenges that we're seeing in terms of trade. But as of today, as we sit here, the rail crossing points are open and flowing normally, and most truck crossing points in the last few days have opened. Some of them are moving a bit slower, but they're open. So it's something that we're going to have to continue to monitor it on a routine basis and recognize that there's multiple driving factors that affect what's happening at the border today.
So with the sort of fluid situation, is your solution, able to kind of jump in between going from intermodal to truck? I know you mentioned EASO does trucking and intermodal. So how does that work?
Yeah, our solution, great question. Our solution is really focused on intermodal. And like I said, intermodal tends to be a much more secure process for shipping than over the road. The intermodal containers don't stop at the border. They actually clear customs at the origin ramp in Mexico, and they move right through the border. So, when trains are moving, it's hard to steal things off of trains, right? And that intermodal solution is really the foundation of the project. Now, I think you were suggesting that perhaps, if we had intermodal issues, that we would be able to pivot back to truck. And certainly we have some truckload activity moving from Mexico up to, for example, our Houston warehouse. As we move into Alliance, certainly we'll see some of that as well, but that's not the foundation of the project, nor what will keep the project sustainable over long periods of time. And typically what you find if you pivot back and forth between different solutions, they tend to have similar issues over longer periods of time. So, the point is a solution for transportation in general is what is required by industry, but certainly there are some added benefits that are natural for intermodal versus over the road, just having that consolidation on one train at a time versus having those multiple units coming across the border. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've touched on a couple of the challenges that your solution is addressing. I mean, the challenges of security, the challenges of customs, the overweight. Any other challenges that you've encountered, with, talking to shippers who may be looking to jump into this market a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. This new border concept this project we have partnered with EASO it's really the first time in my 30 years of selling transportation that I've yet to have a single customer come to me and say the solution doesn't make sense or doesn't fit for them. We're batting 1,000 right now with every customer we're talking to. And we're talking to large CPG companies, small candy makers to, tile manufacturers to spirits companies, right? So every company we've talked to has shown very serious interest. They're at some stage of making commitments to the project. And so we're quite excited about it. And I would tell you that, the companies that are coming to us now, they recognize that, change is imminent, right? It's coming. And shippers really better be thinking about new solutions and be prepared for this change, And I think that really requires finding partners that are collaborative in nature and have experience on both sides of the border. I personally have worked in transportation for about 30 years and 13 years in Mexico. And I've worked with EASO, the Anchustegui family, for about 20 years. And they're a well-respected trucking company in Mexico, been in business for 50 years. So the combination of those two companies and all that experience leads to a better solution for the shipper and certainly more experience in the marketplace. In fact, EASO's chief marketing officer, Diego Anchustegui, is president of AMTI, which is the IANA or Intermodal Association, if you will, of Mexico. So what we're finding is that by working with shippers, they're reaching out and they're asking the hard questions because, as we all know, hope is not a strategy. So, nearshoring is going to drive this change, and we would encourage shippers to step back, evaluate their supply chains and how this change is going to affect them, and develop a strategy now before the storm explodes. That's kind of where our head's at. That's what we've seen, and it's been very positive in terms of the communications we've had in terms of those shippers that are proactively, looking to address what's coming at them here over the next few years.
So, Richard, I got a question, and maybe you mentioned this, and it's not just popping in my head. But so we talk about the heavy commodities and how that's or loading heavy, I guess I would say, in heavy commodities. That's a big fit here. But one of the things that we've experienced, and maybe it's just our lack of connections, but it seems like less than truckload type shipments are difficult out of Mexico into the U.S. So I wonder if a lot of these shippers, are you finding that they might be able to load up, a full load that may have multiple different destinations, bring it into your facility, and you could break it, and maybe they could get a cost savings by doing the U.S. domestic LTL transportation out of Dallas versus out of Mexico?
Yes, that's a great point, Shelley. And we're finding that solution both on a southbound and a northbound basis. So an example is we've got a candy maker in southern Mexico that's coming up full truckload to Alliance. About 70% of what they ship outbound, they'll inventory the product in the warehouse, and about 70% outbound will be LTL shipments. So, likewise, we've got a flooring customer, flooring products customer that's going to bring product into Alliance, ship full truckload to Mexico, and then do the last mile via LTL in Mexico. Really, what's driving that is once you get into Alliance and where our facility is at, you read about the term of supply chain resiliency, optionality, flexibility, whatever term you want to throw at it. Alliance is really a mecca for transportation. So you've got an Alliance airport next door that you have, FedEx flying out of. You've got Amazon warehouses and air services out of Alliance. You have UPS, FedEx, ODFL. You've got Saia, go down the list of all these carriers right next door to Alliance. And so you have this huge inbound market into Alliance and there's not much going outbound. So that provides both capacity, but also all those different kinds of solutions, whether you're shipping over the road, intermodal or LTL, or even parcel coming out of the Alliance area. And what this solution provides is the opportunity to consolidate what would be LTL shipments into full truckload, cross the border, clear it either on the Mexican side or US side, depending on the direction, and then break out freight in Mexico. So it's very exciting because the way this market, the LTL market, has traditionally traded to Mexico, is product would arrive to the border, split out to different brokers, cross the border to the Mexican side, then reconsolidate, and then ship into Mexico. A quite cumbersome and expensive process. By moving full truckload across the border and then executing LTL at either end of the move provides tremendous opportunities for cost savings, but also better service as well.
So you talked about, your experience in the market in Mexico and of course in the US, and you also, of course, having an extensive background. How important is it to have the connections for a shipper, first of all, giving you the lay of the land doing cross-border, but also navigating any potential hiccups that might come up with customs or anything like that?
It's having worked in Mexico for years and years, it remains one of the, most challenging situations, particularly for a new entrant into Mexico. The question of who do I trust with my supply chain, right? And if you find yourself talking to somebody that the feedback they're giving you really doesn't make sense, it's kind of like going to a doctor, right, Kevin? It's, let's make sure I get a second opinion, because if it doesn't make common sense, it probably doesn't make sense at all. And whether that's feedback from a doctor, a lawyer, or whomever, right? That's very much the case here. So making sure that you're connected with somebody that understands both the Mexico and US side of the border. I think that's step one, is really understanding, who you're talking to and what their experience is, because the age-old adage in Mexico is, finding somebody that knows everybody. Well, knowing a lot of people doesn't develop into great solutions. It's critical to understand that you've got people that have years and years of experience of actually delivering results consistently. And that's what we feel really good about with Transportes EASO, being on the Mexican side and having not only having the expertise, but they're more than just your typical non-asset based provider. They actually put containers in the service. They have a large fleet now, and they're growing their fleet of private containers. They have a large fleet of tractors throughout Mexico. They do thousands of loads a month of intermodal throughout Mexico, domestically and internationally today. And so from that standpoint, you're dealing with an asset provider that is not, brokering, co-brokering, any of those risks that you might face or think about. You're dealing with somebody that's going to actually deliver the results. And then once they get into this side of the border, it's the same thing in Spearpoint Logistics. We actually have boots on the ground, assets in place to provide service where it makes sense, and develop those really what we call turnkey solutions to the extent customers need that. In some cases, we have customers that are looking for Spearpoint to provide the intermodal service outbound from Alliance to points throughout the US, as well as regional and local trucking. And we'll do that. In some cases, we'll do that in our assets, and sometimes we'll do that in third-party assets. But we're always upfront with the shipper and make sure they understand what kind of solutions we can provide. And many times they're looking for that turnkey solution. So asking a lot of questions, making sure that you understand, the history and the abilities and the track record of those solution providers is so critical in this market. It's always critical, obviously, but in a cross-border operation where you're making major changes in a supply chain, it's really important that you engage those folks, engage the right folks early in the process, and get a plan in place that's sustainable over a long period of time.
So with nearshoring, we obviously have seen a lot in the news about it. And I think Shelley and I both, in talking to Eduardo and now yourself as well, hearing that we're not really there just yet. It doesn't really quite mesh with a lot of the coverage that's out there. But getting in on the ground floor with any kind of shipping now seems to be your recommendation as it's expected to ramp up. But how much do you see this ramp up going, and how much do you see this sort of changing the game in terms of cross-border?
Yeah, I think there's two factors really to look at whenever you think about the ramp up. The bull case, or the heavyweight case, if you will, is to, like I said, a 54% incremental increase in exports over a 5-year period of time. That's a dramatic increase that will challenge infrastructure, will challenge capacity. It will, challenge the entire supply chain if that in fact happens on a bull case scenario. The base case, if you will, is about 35% increase, and even that number will be a major impact to the entire supply chain out of Mexico. So I think you want to keep that in mind. And probably the more important factor to consider here is that balance between northbound versus southbound demand. Whenever you're thinking about it's 2 to 2.5 to 1 northbound versus southbound today, if we do grow that an incremental 35 to 40% or more, all of that growth is going to be principally, it's hard to say all, but most of that growth is going to be principally export growth to the US. So that gap between southbound, northbound is only going to increase. And so if you think about the infrastructure that's required, both road, rail, et cetera, you've got governments on both sides of the border, the state of Texas, the state of New Mexico, along with, the bordering states in Mexico, Coahuila, Nuevo León, Chihuahua, et cetera, that are really focused on how are we going to handle this growth. They see it coming throughout the country. They see it taxing, electricity, utility supply, over the road infrastructure, et cetera. And so I see these governments recognizing the challenge from a transportation standpoint and understanding that part of the solution has to be intermodal going forward, just out of necessity. So as we move forward into this nearshoring expansion, that's going to tax roads and increase volume by default on intermodal, just because of the capacity constraints. Now, all that being said, as you read about all the taxing, challenging situations you have in Mexico, it's not the first time we've read about those things, right? If you go back 10, 15 years ago, we were reading about same things, oh my gosh, Mexico, exports grew 10%, 15% this year, and there's all these challenges in Mexico. But I will tell you, over time, what the country has demonstrated, again, all politics aside, is that they have consistently grown exports by about 9% compound annual growth rate, with really very limited volatility in terms of that growth rate from year to year, with the exception of two occurrences. So I'm a big believer in the country. Yes, we have challenges in front of us. We always have challenges, but the country has consistently figured out ways to consume those challenges and find solutions to them to continue the trade growth. And I believe that'll be the case with rail as well. We've had a lot of expansion and since privatization in 1997, both in Mexico and at the border. There's new rail bridges being crossed. Each rail crossing is becoming more efficiency from a train standpoint as well, more efficient. And processes are improving daily, if you will, at the border. So while there are challenges and, we do read headlines, overall, I'm very bullish on the opportunity going forward. I think this challenge favors rail for intermodal for the next 5 to 7 years. And I think that it takes all components of the supply chain working together to become as efficient as possible to really take advantage of the opportunities in front of us.
So, Richard, we love how you highlight intermodal. That's always good. We love that, and we agree with it.
A little partial here.
A little partial, yeah, a little biased. But question for you, you mentioned there's a lot of expansion, there's a lot of growth, a lot of new developments with the railroads in Mexico, but they don't expand to all the locations. So I know Monterrey is definitely a hot spot, but can you tell our listeners kind of what are the main areas in Mexico that this intermodal solution would be a real good fit for? Not that the others wouldn't be, but I think it's always good to kind of highlight certain areas that, hey, that's a big win.
Yeah, that's a good one. So commonly people think about Mexico in terms of what is called the Golden Triangle. You've got, roughly 60 to 70% of the population of Mexico resides in a triangle between Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City. And that's where you find the predominant amount of the production as well. And so if you look at the rail lines in Mexico, there's two rail lines, CPKC that runs from Laredo down through Monterrey, San Luis Potosí to Mexico, and then Ferromex that runs from El Paso and Eagle Pass down through over to Monterrey and then down through Torreon to Silao, over to Mexico City, Querétaro, and Guadalajara in that area. So you've got great rail coverage in that zone. Most of the production is in that zone. And so, where we see some opportunities outside that zone would be the northern Chihuahua state, Ciudad Juarez, that area. That's going to be more of a dray move into ramps in El Paso or Santa Teresa area. So that Golden Triangle sets up perfectly for exports to the U.S. via this project, via Alliance. And then you mirror that with the ability to get outbound, as Shelley, to get outbound either to the West Coast, up to Chicago, over to the Northeast, over to, the Southeast as well out of Alliance. There's plenty of options over the road, and Intermodal do that as well. So it's really the way we think about Alliance is a hub and spoke. So if you think about, airlines, American Airlines at DFW Airport, they literally use it as a hub and spoke type of arrangement. And that's what we initially called this service, was a hub and spoke service where, all these products can move in from this golden triangle into Alliance, either store or swing, and then move back out to, the different spoke destinations. So great question. We think it lines up perfectly for intermodal service as well as truckload service in and out of Mexico.
Fantastic.
So where can people go to learn more about this solution and others?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, well, first of all, we're at spearpointlogistics.com. We've got plenty of information about this, details on the solution out there today. And certainly, I want to share my personal email. I'd love to talk to anybody that's interested in the solution. It's rmiller@spearpointlogistics.com. I'm always happy to have the conversation. And I will tell you that over the years, I've learned in terms of building relationships with Mexican shippers and U.S. shippers that, it doesn't always, those conversations that do not always translate into, volume for the company you're representing. But, over time, it's amazing how those opportunities and building those relationships always come around long term. And so I'm always happy to talk to shippers, even if that doesn't mean business for Spearpoint. If you need advice or you need somebody to talk to about Mexico, I'm happy to help folks out and provide guidance and support to the extent I can.
Great, Richard. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Shelley. And Kevin, we really appreciate the opportunity and time to talk about the solution, and look forward to working with you all in the future.
Thanks for joining us for InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. And thanks very much to Richard Miller for taking the time to speak with us. Check out the links in the description to learn more about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available, and you can help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen. If you have questions, email us at podcast@inteklogistics.com and visit intekfreight-logistics.com for more about what we do. For Shelley Austin, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll talk to you next time.